Hello and welcome back. If you guys are just tuning in, there's still a wasp in my house. And if you're following from last time, we're ready, okay? This wasp will not vex us. Never let it get you down. So, okay, we're looking at the structures and functions of the Constitution as we see it today. I had touched on this a minute ago when we were, well, I guess, in the previous video when we talked about the mechanisms by which the federal government or the founding fathers have put forth initiatives to make sure that the government doesn't encroach on power. Okay, so if you recall, there were two groups of people at the ratification debate. There were the Federalists who wanted the ratification of the Constitution, and there were the Anti-Federalists. Who felt as though the Constitution did not go far enough in protecting individual rights and liberties and were too susceptible to encroachments of power. The idea that we should have a limited government that was extremely small and existed only to protect our individual rights came from the philosopher John Locke. And the idea that people are selfish at their core and if given the opportunity will accumulate more power came from the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. And so these are the two mechanisms to kind of check each other, those two competing ideas. So we're going to look first at the anatomy of the Constitution, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because we're going through next week individually each of these sections. So the preamble is a very important to understand what's about to happen, okay, and the foundation by which they established this Constitution. And I've highlighted here in red some of the more important things that you'll understand. We the people is the idea that this is a self-government, right? Not a king. Government is not imposed onto the people, rather than the people consent to allow to be governed. And in order to form a more perfect union, because the document that came before would not have sustained. Some of the goals of this document are to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, most importantly to secure liberty for ourselves and posterity, which means that they want this document and the United States to endure for many generations to come, which we know it has. Kind of the same, kind of different. Do ordain and establish, have created and agreed upon. Okay, so I had mentioned before different types of government. There's unitary forms of government in which all the authority rests with the national government, and any kind of lower level responsibility are simply prescribed from that national directive. If the state has some responsibility, it is because the federal government allowed them to be. We do not have this type of system in the United States. Another type of system that you'll see is a confederation. This is something like the European Union. And the national government derives all of its authority from the member states up. We allow the government to do this. We have a federal system of government in which power exists both at the national level and within the states, and even then within the states and lower levels of government. There's division of power between these levels, and each of these levels is enforced differently. Okay? So this is where you're going to see the beginnings of federalism. This means that the federal government can do X, Y, Z, and state governments can do A, B, C. However, this is not it's not a black and white line. It, at times in American history, has been interpreted, or what role belongs to government or federal government and what role belongs to state government has been interpreted differently. So we've gone through various phases of federalism. The pendulum of power has swung from states to the federal government and back again, and we're going to go through each one of those. And I'm actually going to put a link to a video that I love to show in my face-to-face classes called A More Perfect Union, because I think it really articulates some of the more modern-day discussions about federalism. If you have the opportunity, I strongly suggest you watch it. It's not even an hour. It's very informative. And I really think it exemplifies federalism modern day. So let's look at it in the past. Okay, like I just said, there's federal government exists on two levels of government. The word federal refers to the central government, And federalism refers to the division of power between the state government and the central government. And you can see federalism articulated in the Constitution in a number of ways. First, the Constitution grants each branch of government specific powers. Referring to the legislative branch, there are two types of powers given to government. Expressed powers, or also called enumerated powers, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 through 17 of the Constitution, enumerates or lists powers given specifically to Congress and exist only within Congress. And then implied powers. Implied powers are derived from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the Necessary and Proper Clause, which states that Congress can make laws that are necessary and proper into carrying in the execution of any one of the expressed powers. So that's a little confusing. Let me go in further. This is a list of all of the expressed powers given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 through 17 of the Constitution. These are things that the federal government has the ability to do, and only the federal government. Declare war, raise armies, regulate money, establish the United States Supreme Court, establish standard and weights of measurement, create nationalization and citizenship laws, define bankruptcy, punish pirates, pirates of the sea, and piracy. And these are things that are expressly written down to given to government. The last article, sorry, I didn't have it written down. The last one, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, listed at the very bottom of this. In fact, let me just pull it up really quick so I can read it to you verbatim. Necessary and proper clause. Congress shall have the ability, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. What that is saying is that Congress has the ability to create any other law that it feels necessary into carrying out the 1 through 17, the express powers. It says here, for example, the biggest one of the largest clauses. Where's my highlighter? Here we go. The highlighter. The largest clauses for using the necessary and proper clause, that looks bad, is the Interstate Commerce Clause. Congress has the ability to regulate commerce amongst the states, and in that way, they can use the necessary and proper clause to form laws that would expand the role of government so that it can do that job. Congress can make a law saying that steamships have to have a national license if they want to deliver goods from one state to another, because that is pursuant to regulating interstate commerce. It is not expressly written down that they have control over steamship operations, but it is implied that they can vis-a-vis the Interstate Commerce Clause. That is kind of a confusing concept. Imagine that I said, I'm allowed to grade your papers, assign you letter grades, and do anything pursuant to that. And so I decided that I was going to change your name because changing your name was pursuant in some way to assigning you a letter grade. If that makes any sense. If it doesn't, please feel free to contact me. One of the reasons why I dislike online classes more than face-to-face is because I can't actively make that change for you here. But anyway, so just know that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's the mechanism that allows the federal government to expand its powers outside of these 17 expressed powers. And usually, they will use this Regulate Interstate and Foreign Commerce Clause as the one that they're trying to go for. Moving forward, I don't want to continue with that one. It might confuse you even more. Is what's happening? Oh, what if I don't want to use it anymore? I just want to stop. Reserved powers and concurrent powers. Reserved powers are any power not given to the federal government are said to be reserved for the states. If it is not listed specifically as being granted to the federal government, then it belongs to the states. And then there's a few concurrent powers, and these are powers that exist both at the federal and the state level. Something like a concurrent power would be something like the ability to tax citizens. Sometimes you'll have a state tax as well as a federal tax. We don't have that in Texas, but many states do. Grant licenses, regulate quality of products, charter banks, things like that are going to be both belonging to the federal government and the state government. Eminent domain is one, the power of government to purchase private property for public use, even if the property owner refuses to sell it. So many things that I would have a discussion about regarding that, like SpaceX has made a couple of attempts at eminent domain. We know a lot of areas near the border are currently being used as eminent domain, but those belong both the federal government and the state government can do that. And here are some other examples, non-exhaustive list of examples of state power. Conduct local and national elections. That's actually very important. Establish Republican forms of government. Provide education belongs only to the state. We'll talk about that a little later on. Regulate within the state commerce, tax estates, regulate land use, things like that. The states are also equally obliged to do certain, the federal government is obliged to do certain things for the states. The federal government must treat states equally, can't change state boundaries without the consent, guarantee a Republican form of government, protect states from foreign invasion, and so on and so forth. So, why do we have federalism? Why is this a big deal, and why am I spending so much time on it to give it its own specific PowerPoint? Is because it is probably one of the single most effective methods by which we can check the power of the federal government. It protects our liberty. It distributes powers such that the state can't get too strong and the federal government can't get too strong. In fact, you might see this a lot today when we are having a lot of these COVID restrictions. The city of San Antonio will implement the stay home, work safe order, but the government at the state level, the governor will implement different orders, and the city then has to capitulate with that and reform it to comply with the state order. And then further, the federal government can order something that the states then have to comply with. So it allows us to respond to local action, respond locally, maintain accountability, and most importantly is protect our liberty. That video that I wanted to show you really exemplifies that point, especially with things like medical marijuana, gun regulation, so many different arguments. Education is going to be one. National health, that I think it's definitely worth your time to go ahead and look at. So I'll post that, and hopefully you guys will get a chance to watch it. So, I have mentioned a moment ago that we have gone through a couple of different eras of federalism in which the power or the concentration of power is kind of shifted between the federal government and the state government. And this is an outline of those different eras. Let me see if I did that. A couple of the most important ones are going to be number 2 and number 3, dual and cooperative federalism. At the beginning of America's founding, we had strong state-centered federalism. This is when there wasn't a lot of utilization of the necessary and proper clause, not a lot of regulation outside of the expressed powers of Congress existed at that time. A couple of key cases that I think are pretty important are going to be McCulloch v. Maryland. McCulloch v. Maryland was a discussion about whether or not Maryland as a state could tax the federal government for the federal bank that they put in their state, and the answer is no. The United States cannot be taxed by a state for implementing that, thus creating one of the first incidences of concurrent powers. And then Gibbons v. Ogden was a very interesting case in which the state of New York wanted to additionally regulate interstate commerce, and this case, Gibbons v. Ogden, gave exclusive control of, in particular, steamship operations in control of interstate commerce to the federal government. Interstate navigation fell as an instance of interstate commerce, and New York states cannot interfere with interstate commerce. They can only regulate intrastate commerce. And so in this way, you're going to see kind of the beginning of a shift from a very strong state-centered federalism to a more dual climactic role of dual federalism. Dual role is it's also referred to as layer cake federalism. It's going to be an arrangement in which the power is very strongly and clearly divided in terms of states exercising a certain amount of power according to them without interference from the federal government. And that's in contrast to your third cooperative form of federalism that worked implementation of certain programs at the state level with oversight by the federal government. That led us into a period of more centralized federalism in which the central government would impose more programs and unfunded mandates to the states, very wildly unpopular, leading into a system of devolution in which we were giving back states rights that once belonged to them. So, let's go through those one to one. Why is my clicky not working? There. All right, so like I said before, dual federalism kind of comes about as a result of these Supreme Court cases, Gibbons v. Ogden and McCulloch v. Maryland, in which the states were attempting to infringe upon some of the express rights of the federal government. Gibbons v. Ogden in the case of interstate commerce, and McCulloch v. Maryland in the case of taxing the United States Bank. In both cases, they said the state lost the power to do that exclusively, and that belongs to the federal government. So we see a very clear line, or something called strict interpretation of the laws and the expressed powers. So they are interpreting the powers of government as strictly, and the powers of the state government also extremely narrowly. So at this time, you'll see the federal government is very small. It dealt primarily with foreign affairs and commerce. Okay, taxes, regulating commerce, and social programs and things like that were left largely to the states. Roads and canals, infrastructure and things like that were very largely state. So one of the things that brings dual federalism kind of to a climactic head is the Civil War, in which the federal government attempted to regulate the methods by which the southern states were able to exercise their economic powers, which is a fancy way of saying slavery. It was a very clear and definitive fundamental disagreement about the division of power between the national and state governments. Both of these political battles ostensibly were solved through legislative compromise or Supreme Court decisions, but there was still a lot of underlying tension and disagreement about the states' rights that were going to eventually play in part to the reason we began at the Civil War. There's a couple of instances with regard to the Supreme Court decisions during dual federalism that really brought this to a head. South Carolina's nullification doctrine and the nullification by Wisconsin, in which states would nullify Supreme Court decisions. States would then nullify the federal decisions at the state level, which we know is not constitutional. Dual federalism ends right around the time FDR is attempting to re-establish the economy after the Great Depression. So around 1937, generally consensus is during the presidency in 37, when the New Deal policies came into play, was when the end of federalism took place, and then you have a system of cooperative federalism, which also could be referred to as marble cake federalism. And this is where you're going to see a lot of levels of government working together, cooperating together, and largely implemented at the state level while having federal oversight in order to combat poverty and revamp the economy. So you'll see things like the works projects or works programs that the federal government would provide grants and aid or categorical grants, funds from the federal government to state and local entities for a specific purpose as an effort to reduce the level of unemployment as a result of the Great Depression. So like the San Antonio Zoo, there was a huge expansion of the San Antonio Zoo as a part of the works program. If you go by the Lowry Landing, then you'll see a sign that says that this was an improvement based upon the work programs. Hoover Dam, a lot of things like that. It's the federal government using Interstate Commerce Clause and Necessary and Proper Clause to largely expand the role of government. It best looks like a marble cake. If you guys aren't familiar, I have a picture of it in just a second. So the New Deal provided grants and aid or categorical grants to state and local governments for a specific purpose, expanded social programs, included competitive block grants where people would compete with other private agencies for federal contracts to perform some sort of what's the word, project for the federal government. And all of the funds were based on merit of their proposal. So this really did do a great job in lifting the United States out of its economic depression, but expands the role of the federal government substantially. Huge expansion of the role of the federal government. This leads us into LBJ's Great Society. While there was a lot of praise, some people felt controversial about it, but the New Deal and cooperative federalism led into this era of the Great Society that LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, used to combat poverty, but they increased the proliferation of what's called unfunded mandates was extremely unpopular. A couple of examples of that are the Americans with Disabilities Act, teacher pay raises, Environmental Protection Agency policies that are federal acts that the states are required to implement, but they're forcing the states to pay for it themselves. So essentially, 14 states to spend their own money to comply with federal laws. And the Americans with Disabilities Act I use as an example because it's kind of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Everybody believes that Americans with disabilities should have the same access to buildings and ability to read the same, door numbers, the ability to know if there's a fire based on the fire alarms. So while this was a good act, it required a lot of things from private businesses. Private businesses had to expand their doorways such that wheelchairs could fit in. They had to put ramps and elevators in so people with handicaps can access buildings, which we all think they should, but it required that it do it on its own dime. And so the controversy here was, who's going to pay for this construction? I'm barely making ends meet as it is, and it really put out a lot of small businesses. Same thing with environmental protection agencies, largely with how to get rid of their waste. While they used to just dump it in the back, now they have to get rid of it more responsibly. That costs them more money, and they're not being compensated for that. It's called an unfunded mandate. Texas recently issued an unfunded mandate that required school districts to give a 3% pay raise to teachers, but did not provide them any funds. So essentially it's like, hey, you have to change your policy and costs yourself. A lot of backlash came from that. This led to start under Nixon and kind of continued up until today, until 1995, called devolution. That's when we were transferring the responsibility and responsibilities back to the state government. The first time you'll see this at the Supreme Court level was United States v. Lopez case, in which the federal government limited its own power to regulate guns on school campuses. So United States v. Lopez was the first instance in many, many years, like 50, in which the federal government limited its own power by the Gun-Free School Zone Act. Alfonso Lopez was this idiot gentleman who brought he brought a gun onto Edison High School campus here in San Antonio. Now, he didn't do it for a nefarious reason. He wasn't going to shoot the school, but he did it because he wanted to sell it to a buddy, and the best place to do that is to go on campus, evidently. And there was a federal law that existed at the time called the Gun-Free School Zone Act, in which, you're not allowed to bring guns onto school zones. He was arrested and charged with a federal crime, but he said, hey, wait, that is a violation, an overreach of federal power to regulate guns on campuses using the Interstate Commerce Clause. The federal government argued that they had to use that power. Hold on, my husband. Alfonso Lopez says that the regulation of guns on school campuses is a violation of the federal government's, it's an overreach of the federal government. The federal government said it has to regulate guns on campuses because if guns are on campus, people will feel less safe and they will be less likely to move to that area and increase the commerce within that area, which sounds crazy, and it is. And the federal government, the United States Supreme Court said that's crazy, this is clearly an overreach, and for the first time in many years, it gave back the power to regulate guns on campuses to schools and to school districts and states. You want to go downstairs?
Yeah.
Okay. Say bye to the camera.
Bye, camera.
You take a sad. There is one case that I forgot to mention that's extremely important regarding dual federalism, and that case is Wickard v. Filburn. Wickard v. Filburn was a case, and you guys, I really miss saying it in front of class because I like to see the reactions of students. Wickard v. Filburn was a case that a gentleman, a farmer, was given a federal permit to cultivate 10 acres of wheat. He ended up growing 11 acres, and that 1 extra acre was to feed his own personal livestock. That livestock was not sold, so it was grown, harvested, and ingested all on his land, and he got fined from the federal government for growing in excess of his permit. He argued, that's crazy, you don't have the ability to fine me, it is not interstate commerce because it's not leaving my land. And Wickard v. Filburn was a case that expanded the role of federal government beyond it's ever seen. The federal government argued that if that action of taking additional land for personal and private use was replicated elsewhere, that it would eventually drive down the market prices, causing another depression, and thereby is a matter of interstate commerce. So that's crazy. Wickard v. Filburn expanded the role of the federal government, while United States v. Lopez starts devolution in transferring back power to the states. And since then, that's kind of what we've been doing. It's, again, a modern day kind of back and forth with regards to who has the power. States are trying to fight for power, and so is the federal government. So let's move on. Here you can see a graphic of the separation of the powers between the states and the federal government during both phases of federalism. Dual federalism, strict and defined powers and responsibilities given to the national government as compared to the state governments, followed by cooperative federalism that has a lot of governmental oversight at the national level, but implementation at state levels. You'll see a lot of cooperation there. Since 2000, we have a lot more or evolving issues of federalism. The use of marijuana, whether or not a state can regulate that. We know at the federal level, marijuana through the Controlled Substance Act is still illegal, while many states have decriminalized marijuana usage in one capacity or another. That film that I'm referring to talks a lot about that. The ability to regulate guns, elections, who can regulate elections, especially if you have an area of high discrimination or discriminatory practices and policies. Does that belong to the federal government or at the state level? The Affordable Care Act would be a pretty good example of whether or not the federal government has the ability to ensure health care subsidies for individuals, education benefits. There's a Supreme Court case, United States v. Rodriguez, San Antonio v. Rodriguez, I'm sorry, that says the federal government cannot intervene in school funding to equalize school funding. Some people believe that it should. But there is no clear and defined rule. These things are always changing, especially with regard to the necessary and proper clause, depending on the situation and the tone of society, so to speak, really defines whether or not you're going to have that power rest with the federal or state government. It's a very convoluted idea, not easily understood. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to contact me. I am going to post the video. I think it's very important. If you have the opportunity to watch it, I strongly suggest you do. Maddie, Bob, can you say bye to my students?
Bye.
They said bye. Bye.